somehow the last lecture did not end up getting recorded. I remember hitting record or attempting to, but somehow I must have not done it right or something. So our whole Kant lecture is gone, unfortunately. And so the people that missed it, I'm not sure what to do. Maybe I can give you like a Cliff Notes version of what we went over. Um, but basically, Kant is it's the end of our historical survey, right? We looked at just a portion of the history of philosophy. We can't possibly look at everything, but I like to do two things in an intro to philosophy class. I like to look at the way that ideas have grown and the way in which philosophy developed and the way it developed into math and science and all that. To tell a historical story, basically. Educate yourself about where we came from, what some of the great thinkers have thought, and how they relate to one another, and how they deal with issues in different ways. Right, that's our historical survey, and now we're going to move into sort of a topic by topic approach, where we don't have to go through it historically, even though in some cases we do, like in philosophy of mind, what we're doing now, but it won't be in the same way. Okay, it's more going to be focused on a specific issue, and then the different kinds of takes you might take on it, might have on it, the different kind of theories philosophers have presented. Right, so that's what we're doing here. Kant was just our final piece of that journey, and basically Kant was able to take certain elements of rationalism and empiricism and combine them in a way to avoid the problems that both of them had. Right, that was basically his approach. Whether or not he succeeded in that is another thing. But this is a way that you can think of Kant. Kant sort of synthesizes both of these movements, or both of these 10 ways of thinking. Yes, I am recording. Thank you, Jason. So that's what Kant represents. I don't know how much I'd want to go over everything we went over again. Kant's basic insight is that our minds bring a lot to the table. So he's not like Berkeley, who thinks everything is just from God's head to your from God's mind to your mind. He doesn't think that. Kant thinks as human beings we are walking around, or we exist in a real objective world. It's just that as sentient conscious beings, for us to know about the world and not simply be a part of it, which is what everything does, right? For us to know about it, we have to represent reality in some way. And to represent reality in some way, we have to give it some sort of shape and structure that's intelligible to us. Right? So Kant's whole approach is, well, look, you do know stuff about the world, right? What makes that possible? Well, what makes that possible is the fact that you have a mind that imposes a kind of a structure on the raw data that we get from the world. Right? And we can never escape that structure. So for Kant, it's meaningless to try to talk about a reality that exists outside of your own mind, because nothing can be known about that. To know anything at all is to know it as some sort of sensory object, right? Some sort of object in space and time. So Kant is kind of on the side of people like Descartes and other people who thought reality is made of extended stuff. It's just that for Kant, reality as we know it is always going to be phenomenal. It's always going to be what we as human beings observe and experience, which is always going to be different from reality as it is in itself, what Kant called the noumenal world. Right. So yes, we can do science and we can do philosophy, we can do all this stuff, but we need to understand that any attempt to go beyond the structure that our minds necessarily impose on the world and on our experience, any attempt to go beyond that is bound to end in failure. And this is why Kant sees the history of metaphysics as a history of failures, because metaphysicians have tended to try to go beyond what is given to us in experience, and you just cannot do that, says Kant. So he's kind of siding with Hume there. Hume was also critical of the whole history of metaphysics, right? People thinking they know things that they don't, which is exactly what we're not supposed to do if we take Socrates as our hero. Right? So Hume was critical and Kant as well, but Kant in a different way than Hume. Kant tried to make it so that philosophy could once again be a positive project. There's something for philosophers to do. Just don't make that mistake of thinking that you're getting at reality as it is truly in itself. That's impossible. We cannot reach that noumenal world. We can only have we can only know truths about the world of phenomena, and of course the way in which our minds organize phenomena. And this is what Kant thought philosophy could do, right? Philosophy could that could be its role. Whereas the sciences are telling us about very specific things that happen out there. Philosophy can tell us about the general structure of that, because all you need to do is know your own mind, right? You can know what your experience is like, and you can know, for example, that you only see objects that are extended in 3 dimensions. That's a necessary feature of your experience, so we can talk about that as philosophers. We can talk about how our minds impose those categories. And so we can escape Hume's fork, right? Where Hume thought you could only have analytic a priori statements that are just true by definition, and you can only have empirical statements, either statements just of your own personal experience of looking around the room, or scientific sort of theories, and everything else is just garbage. Kant is suggesting, no, there's a third possibility. There's the a priori synthetic, right? Which is, I can think about the structure of my mind, and it's an informative thing to get into. It's something we can learn about. It's not just true by definition, right? It's a substantive truth that we can get at about the human condition when we understand the way in which our minds necessarily impose categories on the world and necessarily organize experience in a cohesive way. We can learn something about the human mind. So this is actually kind of a good segue into our next topic, which is philosophy of mind. Right? So some of you may be thinking, Kant, aren't you thinking of psychology? Isn't that just the science of the mind? And we might tend to agree with that. We can see Kant as a proto-psychologist, though. And you can see that the earliest people who were into psychology, people like Freud, of course, and Jung, were very influenced by philosophers like Kant. And also notice that those early psychologists tend to be armchair psychologists, right? An armchair psychologist is someone who just thinks about the nature of the mind and comes up with all sorts of theories without necessarily doing rigorous empirical testing the way you would expect to in hard sciences. So this is why a lot of times contemporary science of the mind, contemporary psychology, tends to bash Freud a little bit, those early psychologists, because they were sort of doing it a priori, like Kant said you could do, right? They were thought, well, you can do science of the mind in this a priori way because all you need is introspection. You just need to be able to see how your mind works, and then you could just write it down, and there you go. Right? But that's not very scientific, is it? So it's an armchair psychologist kind of approach. That's sort of what Kant was doing. And so the main criticism of Kant is then, at least from my perspective, it's all the specific things he came up with, all the specific theories about the categories of the understanding, that there's exactly 12 of them, right? All this sort of stuff. There, I take that with a grain of salt, whereas his great insight is, yes, your mind, or now we would say the brain, is able to do all this sort of stuff. It's not just a completely blank slate. It has a structure that allows it to organize experience. But I would say it's better to do that with scientific methodology. Right? So I think it's better, if you're going to do that, do it scientifically the way scientists and neuroscientists do it now, as opposed to the way that Kant was doing it. Some philosophers might want to tear my head off for saying that. Okay, so just to give you a perspective, that's my particular take on it. Not everyone's going to agree with that. But I think Kant has a major insight, right? His major insight is our experience is structured and limited by the ways in which our mind sort of processes the raw sensory data that we get from the world. I would just say that the correct way to study that is by some sort of scientific methodology, rather than this a priori just sitting there thinking about stuff approach that Kant is favoring. Okay, so let's put Kant behind us then and talk about philosophy of mind. Obviously, it's kind of self-explanatory what it's going to be, right? We're going to ask philosophical questions about the nature of the mind. Although, as we'll see in contemporary circles and contemporary debates, the mind has the focus has shifted from the mind in general to the phenomenon of consciousness specifically. Okay, so we'll track that shift, but we'll start out just talking about the mind in general. Okay. Because it's very hard to start anywhere without any kind of bias, let us start with what is sometimes called folk psychology. So, folk psychology is not an academic field. Folk psychology is just what ordinary human beings use to navigate our social reality, right? When you interact with other people, you know just intuitively, you don't even have to think about it most of the time, right? You understand that other people have their motivations, they've got their desires, they've had their experiences that inform their worldview, and so when you try to explain people's behavior, you explain it with reference to certain mental states, right? Why is this person behaving so strangely? Well, maybe they are hallucinating a dragon and they think they're fighting it. Well, that's some abnormal psychology going on, but certainly if you saw a person behaving very strangely and erratically, you're going to try to come up with some sort of psychological explanation. But it's also for very everyday, mundane sorts of things, right? You have to guess at the state of a person's mind all the time. Think about having a relationship with a person. You're constantly trying to figure out what's going on inside the person's mind and why they're behaving the way they're behaving. And they're questioning you as well, right? So you have to explain where you're coming from sometimes. So we explain our behavior with reference to mental states, things that we characterize as mental states, things like believing or desiring or wanting or thinking. These sorts of things explain our behavior, and we use those concepts to navigate, like I say, our social scene, our social environment. Social environment, I just mean, I'm a person, you're a person, we'll all have to sort of get along and cooperate and do stuff. Yeah, the Turing test. We will talk about the Turing test. It has a lot of philosophical significance, and it's going to have a lot to do with philosophy of mind. So I'm glad you brought up the Turing test, and we will definitely talk about it. Yeah, it's relevant. Yeah. So here I'm just sort of trying to get you to understand we have sort of an intuitive psychological theory that we work with when we engage with one another, when we talk with one another, right? If you talk to a person in person, you have to make certain assumptions about where they're at. You have to make certain assumptions about what they know about your life, right? If you're talking to a perfect stranger and you're trying to explain something about yourself, you might have to fill in the blanks more because they know less. Whereas you're trying to explain something about yourself to a good friend, you could leave behind a bunch of the background information because you know that they know about that already, right? So it involves a lot of you knowing what someone else knows or you knowing what somebody else doesn't know, right? We're projecting mental states into people all the time, and we try to explain why they behave the way they behave. And when you try to decide how to act towards someone, how to be towards someone, how to treat them, you have to make assumptions about their mental states. So whenever you do any of this stuff, just very automatically and fluidly, sometimes you have to actually stop and really think about it, but just everyday situations, even going to the grocery store, you're employing folk psychology all the time. You know that person over there would not expect you to engage in this behavior or it'll freak them out, so you don't do that behavior, right? It involves a lot of projecting into other people what they're likely to think about your behavior, how they're likely to react, right? We do this kind of psychology all the time. So if you see, for example, do this kind of like an anthropologist or something like that. If you see somebody, just washing their hands, right? You see somebody turn on the water, they get some soap, they wash their hands, right? And they put their hands under the water, and they quickly withdraw them, and they go, ow! And then you see them adjust, and then they start washing their hands, and they go like this. And so you see all this visual behavior, but we understand that kind of behavior. I gave you an example of a behavior that's very familiar to us, and how you will explain it. This doesn't just look like a random weird behavior. It's because you understand that this is a person with a mind, with certain emotions and certain beliefs about the nature of reality, right? For example, you can pretty easily say that it's very likely that this person is trying to be healthy, right? They want to not get sick. Right? Now, this might not be what's going on. I'm just saying, in most cases, if you see somebody engaging in the behavior that I just described, right, washing hands with soap, but then putting it under the water, quickly withdrawing them and going, ow, then readjusting it, washing their hands, they're fine. How do we explain all this behavior? Why does it look perfectly intelligible to you? Why isn't it weird? Well, you know that that human being behaving in that way is being guided by their mental states. Right? Their behavior is explained by certain things that are true of them, but these are things that we say are true of someone's mental states. This is what we're partly defining what we mean by a mental state, or by what the mind can do, or the state that a mind can be in, right? We're kind of defining it in this way. A desire, for example, right? This person wants to be healthy. They also have a belief. They believe that washing your hands with warm water and soap is healthy because, you get rid of germs so you don't get sick easily. You can fill in all the blanks. I'm saying it very simply here, just as a kind of an intuitive way that we would understand this person's behavior. And also understand that when they first put in their hands underneath the hot water, it was too hot for them, right? That's pretty apparent, right? Especially if you also see steam rising, so you know that it's not too cold, for example, right? And most people don't say ow when it's cold, right? They go roo, roo, right? This person's like ow. Maybe they're even saying ow hot, right? So you see that, so you understand that that behavior was because they felt something internally, right? Now notice that feeling, you don't actually feel that feeling of pain, right? But it's very easy to project that when somebody is putting their hands under warm running water and they quickly withdraw their hands and go, ow! You recognize, oh, they felt some pain. They had this internal, subjective state of mind. We only see the behavior, the surface of it, but we tend to assume there's some sort of mental state that makes sense of that behavior, right? So feeling is a mental state. Believing, having a belief, we're going to call that a mental state as well, even though belief and feeling are very, very different, aren't they? They're very different phenomena, okay? But we are calling belief and desire also, these are things that characterize the mind. This is simply how we're defining what a mind is, right? You could have a problem with that. You could have a different definition of mind, but you sort of have to start somewhere. Notice we're doing the same sort of thing that Descartes did. Descartes just had sort of a list of things, right? Thinking, imagining, remembering, feeling, perceiving. Those are all things that characterize the mind. That's just what we mean by mind in philosophy of mind. Right? So if this contradicts your definition of the mind, that's fine. It's just that these are the phenomena that we're interested in. We're interested in phenomena like desiring and believing and feeling, having visual experiences, right? Perceptions. Right? This person has a visual experience of the faucet, so they know it's there. Right? That's part of the reason that they're able to then adjust that spigot when they need to, right? Because they can see it, they can go right for it. They're having a visual experience. This also explains their behavior. If they didn't have the visual experience, their behavior might be slightly different. And again, another belief. They have this belief in their head, based on experience, of course, that if the water's too hot, all you need to do is adjust it a little bit. Without that belief, she wouldn't have done that, right? If she didn't think that would make any difference, right? So we can see that just just one little snapshot of just someone's simple behavior of washing their hands, we could see here that that's only intelligible, only understandable behavior to us because we are used to projecting all these mental states to a person. And without those mental states, the behavior would look really weird. Right? And that's why when someone's behavior is really weird, it tends to be because we don't understand where they're at mentally. We don't understand what their beliefs are, what their desires are, what their fears are, what their emotional state is. Right? That's what makes someone's unpredictable, weird behavior so inscrutable and kind of scary to us, because we're sort of not understanding the mental states that normally make sense out of behavior. You know, so we can. This is all just folk psychology, right? This is all stuff you do anyway. This is stuff you do in everyday context all the time. It's just most of the time you're not even conscious of it, right? But the idea is that we all have a kind of a folk psychology. We have a kind of a psychological theory about human motivation that we rely on in order to deal with one another, in order to navigate our social environment. So you can think of just a general sketch then. There's a general layout we can look at. We can break it down in terms of inputs, internal states, and then outputs. Right? We get all sorts of cues and clues from the physical environment. What is happening in your immediate physical environment? That is going to inform what kind of mental state you have. Right? Mental state will include your perception of the room around you. Right? We talk a lot about perception of the room around you, isn't it? Yeah. So your physical environment, depends on what kind of room you're in, what kind of room experience you will have, right? Assuming we're all in a room here, we're all in different rooms. So your room experience is different because your environment is different. Right? So we all have these different environments, and these are constantly bombarding us with information. And that information, whether it's purely sensory, like light waves, right? Or if somebody's telling us something, someone's talking, that's an input from the physical environment. Those cause us to have certain mental states. Those cause us to have sensory experiences of the room. They cause us to have beliefs. I am in a room. Right? They cause us to have desires. Right? Maybe you see somebody having a tasty beer, and suddenly now you have a desire for a tasty beer. Okay? All sorts of ways in which our physical environment leads us to have certain mental states. And mental states are just all these things that we're talking about. Sensory experiences, beliefs, desires, thoughts, emotional states. Yeah? Those all count as mental states. And then those mental states then go on to inform our behavior. We explain our behavior in terms of those mental states. Yeah. So there will be some automatic behavior on your part, like autonomic responses and things like that. Like your heart, for example. That's part of your behavior. Now, of course, sometimes your mental state can actually affect your heart rate, can't it? But for the most part, your heart beats on its own. You don't have to make it beat, right? So there are certain body physical processes that you can just say, well, we're not talking about those. We're talking about mostly intentional behavior and then some other automatic behavior. Like, yeah, for example, if suddenly someone startles you, then you might not have any choice over it, but you have a fear response, right? That can happen. Or if something tickles your nose, right? An input from the physical environment might make you feel itchy, and that then leads to a sneeze. So it can lead to automatic kind of behavior, but in many cases it's intentional behavior, right? So if we look at the person washing their hands, and suppose they're not an OCD person who feels like they have to wash their hands all the time, right? Just a normal person came home from going outside, is following good protocol, wash your hands really well. It's an intentional behavior, right? They meant to do that. Right? They were acting on their beliefs and their desires, right? The person desired to be germ-free, and they believe this is a good way to keep germs off your hands. So this explains their intentional behavior. And so this is part of what any philosophy of mind will have to try to account for to some extent. We could also end up saying that this whole picture is wrong, right? That there's something wrong with folk psychology. It's possible, but it's a good starting place. And many theories of mind try to account for this very intuitive sense in which we think, okay, we get input from the environment, we get mental states, and then those mental states connect to our behavior. You know, very sort of simple way of looking at it. It gets more complicated because it turns out your own mental states can also act as inputs, right? Uh, so that makes it a little bit more complicated. But overall, you can see this kind of picture is operative in our everyday dealing with people. And if you're going to have a philosophy of mind, then we want to be able to explain how it is possible for human beings to have these things called mental states. How is this possible? Now, we saw what Descartes thought, right? Descartes thought this would only be possible for an immaterial soul to have mental states. And he had his argument for that, and we'll look at that again. But that's not the only way to think about it, of course, right? And if you think about modern science, then you know that brain science has a lot to say about mental states. Okay. So this is the sort of general picture we want to make sense of. We have this idea that our mental states are able to cause our behavior. You know, that they're causally connected. So those arrows indicate some sort of causal connection. That our mental states are not just these free-floating things that have nothing to do with our behavior. Right? No. Our mental states are actually what cause our behavior, and this is how we explain people's behavior. So mental states, on this intuitive folk psychology view, they're very important to explain our behavior. Right? They're not just sort of, these free-floating things that have no effect in the world. No, we explain people's behavior based on their mental states. Right? It's your desires and your beliefs, mostly, that determine your intentional, voluntary, on-purpose kind of behavior. Right? The behavior that you're meaning to do, not just doing automatically or by instinct or anything like that. Your rational, intentional behavior is caused by your desire and your beliefs about the world. Or another example, we're going to talk about this more when we talk about free will. We tend to think that we're morally responsible for our behavior, right? We do think that, right? We think it's bad for someone to just murder a person for no good reason, right? It's just a paradigm case. Why is that the case? Well, because you could have not killed the person, right? There's the idea of free will. Instead, you chose to do this behavior. Right? So we're showing that there's a link here between the behavior and your mental state. You intended to do the behavior. You had an intention. That intention is mental, right? Your choice is mental. Whatever mental ends up meaning, right? We're not yet saying it's physical, non-physical, whatever. We're just using mental as a catch-all term for all these kinds of things that human beings can do. Things like intending. So, right, we distinguish between a free will action and a non-free will action partly by looking at, did the person intend to do the action? Right. So an intention is a mental state, and now here's a behavior, and we want to categorize it. Is it free will or not? Well, if you didn't mean to do it, if something made you do it, then it's not free will. Right? But if you actually wanted to do that, that was your desire, that's exactly what you had in mind, you're trying to do it, then it's a free will action, and then you're morally responsible for it. Right, so folk psychology also ties in with morality in that way, because we judge people's behavior based on the kinds of mental states that led to that behavior. Okay? And we can see this clearly in law and in legal cases and the prosecution of criminals and things like that. It's very, very important to establish what kind of motive there was, if there was a motive, or what kind of other circumstances were in play. So these mental states are very important, at least in the way we live our everyday lives. Right? We tend to kind of rely on this folk psychology where we not only observe the environment and the behavior, we tend to also project mental states into people even though, of course, right, uh, I don't actually feel your pain, right? If you step on a Lego with bare feet and you go, ow, all I can actually observe is that output behavior and the input from the physical environment. But I very naturally just project onto you the same feeling that I would have if I stepped on a piece of Lego with bare feet, right? I understand, oh, you're probably having this internal mental state of being in pain. You know? So the question philosophy of mind is, how does that work, right? What is it to have a pain, for example, if we wanted to get specific? Right? Is a pain something you can have as a purely physical being? Or do you have to be some sort of immaterial soul? Or does it work some other way? So there are different ways to think about this, but the main point is we're trying to explain mental states. We're trying to come up with some sort of theory. And hopefully, of course, a theory that's actually scientifically fruitful, something that will actually lead to some science being done. All the best examples of philosophy in the past were like that, right? There were things that maybe itself was kind of a leap and maybe not entirely justified, but then sometimes that leads to doing actual good science. Right? So, even Kant, we can credit him for that as sort of getting the ball rolling on psychology and really taking the mind seriously and not just thinking that it's this simple substance, right? Rather, the mind is a very complicated thing that needs to be studied. I think Kant was wrong in how to study it, but eventually that led to good psychology, good science of the mind. And so hopefully the theory that we come up with is one that is scientifically fruitful. But it's also possible that the mind simply is not something that's amenable to scientific investigation, as Descartes had claimed, right? That the mind is just purely non-physical, and everything that it is capable of because of its internal nature, which is completely non-physical and not amenable to scientific investigation, right? Descartes' soul is not something you can study scientifically. Right? So, if that's the case, then maybe we can't have a science of the mind. Maybe it's not possible to understand it through empirical methodology, right? So, these are some of the questions we're having to deal with. Okay. I am going to switch over the slideshow to a different one. I'm going to leave the recording on this time, even though that's more boring for the people watching the video. I have to because sometimes I forget to turn it back on, and that's not good. Okay, I'll just connect it to my phone, and then we'll be all set. Okay, there we go. So, an actual little intro to philosophy of mind where we just sort of sketch, the sort of things you can talk about when you're doing philosophy of mind. And we won't talk about all these things, but these are just some of the questions you might want to ask. Right, so, this is a little bit different from what we just did. I introduced the concept of folk psychology, which is just our everyday understanding of human psychology and the way in which we rely on it all the time. Right? You sort of have a theory of mind already operating, already causing you to behave in a certain way, right? Simply the fact that you recognize a human being is itself a huge feat of being able to tell, oh, there's another creature with a mind like me over there, and you're automatically going to treat them differently than just a physical object, because you realize physical objects, mere physical objects like coffee cups, don't have mental states. They don't feel pain or things like that. So you might want to just separate the different kinds of questions you can ask in philosophy of mind. Right? Semantic questions have to do with questions about meaning, and that is important, because if you can try to ask a philosophical question about the mind the way that Socrates might, right? If the question is, what is the mind really? The, you might have to address semantic questions first. Well, you kind of, what do you mean by mind, right? Do you mean mind the way we use this in ordinary language? Then we might just have to investigate how people use that word, right? How is the word mind used? And then we get a kind of an answer about the way that that word is used. We might make an assumption, as people often do, that noun phrases, noun words, always actually refer to a specific thing. And so we have the word mind, and so you might assume that, well, we've got a word dog, and you could write like the word dog with an arrow pointing to a dog, right? The word dog means what it means because it refers to this specific thing. You might assume that all noun words are like that. You might assume that mind must be the same kind of thing, right? That it's must refer to some sort of substance, some sort of thing that you can point to, some sort of particular. Right? But maybe it's not like that. Right? Maybe the word mind is just a quick way of talking about all these different processes, mental processes, right? We talked about mental states. Maybe there isn't a thing called the mind, right? We kind of touched on this a little bit with Hume, right? When you look at a waterfall, for example, when you say waterfall, you're just talking about all the different stages of the water falling, right? There's no separate entity from the water falling that's a waterfall that has the property of these water falling stages. It's not like that. It's just one thing there, right? So maybe mind actually just refers to all the processes, and it's not actually the name of a thing at all, right? So these are things you might have to think about from the get-go. What are you even meaning by mind? I think it's simplest if we start with just, well, mental phenomena, right? Mental processes, mental states, the way I explained it in the folk psychology part. That's a good beginning, and then we can think about, well, is it a specific thing that has to have those mental states? How does that work? Then that'll be the next question. But for now, it's just something to be aware of. Semantics, the meanings of words, how we assign meanings to words, these are always going to be relevant as well to any kind of question, even though you think you're just doing metaphysics or something like that. There's more to it. You have to sort of get clear about the meanings of the terms. Okay. What we're really interested is the metaphysical questions. Okay? That's really what it's all about. The big one is, what is the relationship between the mind or mental states and the body, maybe specifically the brain? Right? I mean, there's one relationship that seems to be obvious that we rely on in folk psychology. One is that the mind has an effect on the body, and the body can have an effect on the mind, right? So again, if I stick my hand in hot water, my body will shoot up the signal that my brain interprets as pain. So my body is causing my mind to have this sensation, this mental state. And that mental state, my pain, causes me to withdraw my hand very quickly. So there seems to be a causal relationship. It seems to be like that whatever the mind is, whether it's physical or non-physical, right? Again, we're not quite making up our mind about that. Whatever these mental states are, as long as we agree that we do have these mental states, right? The feeling of pain and the desire to stop pain, these are all mental states. There's a relationship there between my bodily behavior and then the mental states that I have, right? But there's also the question of the brain, of course, right? What role does the brain play in all that? When Descartes was philosophizing, he was aware of the brain and he knew it was somehow important, but he was not quite aware of how much the brain actually does and how much we've actually learned about the different areas of the brain and all the mental functions that they are good for. It becomes very hard to imagine that there's an immaterial soul that's doing all this, because we know that the brain is doing a bunch of this. Right? Now, you might still say something like, well, the soul is pure consciousness, but it needs to hook up to some sort of brain machine. We'll look at that kind of possibility as well. But for now, it's just definitely a question, right? We know that the brain is very important to mental function. So what does that mean? Is the brain simply what makes the mind possible? Right? That's a very sort of contemporary scientific approach. A lot of people feel very comfortable with that approach, saying, yeah, the brain is simply what makes the mind possible. You need the brain for mental states, and that's all there's really to it. So we're going to explore that quite a bit, right? But we'll also explore counter arguments. So yeah, the relationship between the brain and the mind, or the relationship between mental states and behavior, right? So if the mind is a kind of stuff, let's say Descartes was right. Let's say the mind is not the brain. And let's say it's immaterial, but it's some kind of stuff. Right? So if basically, let's say you are convinced by Descartes and you're like, yeah, the mind is this non-physical, immaterial thing. It can't be the body because of the arguments that he provided, which we will revisit. Well, then, of course, you still have a huge question left over that Descartes did not really address. Well, what the heck is that? What is that immaterial stuff that you're talking about? What is that substance? And what kind of structure does it have to allow for mental states? Sometimes people just can't imagine that purely physical stuff, a bunch of atoms, can give rise to conscious experience. And it is a little bit mind-boggling sometimes to think about it, right? It's kind of weird to think that when I pinch myself, I know there's all this physical stuff going on, but I also feel that pain, and that pain somehow feels different, right? So I kind of get the intuitive appeal to that no, the part of me that feels pain is not the physical thing. But then you still have to wonder, well, but then how is that non-physical thing able to feel pain? And dualists don't really have a great answer to that, So it's one thing to say, to just, be so incredulous that the brain could do that. I couldn't do that. It must be an immaterial soul. But that does not really answer the question, because then you're still left with the question, how can an immaterial soul do that? How is an immaterial soul able to feel pains? Right? So it does not necessarily answer the question if you go that way. So it's a metaphysical question that you would ask if you wanted to pursue this kind of Cartesian dualism, right? Also, in the same way, if the mind is this immaterial substance like Descartes said it is, then how does it interact with the body and the brain, right? Because apparently there is interaction, right? This is what our folk psychology is telling us. That's what we just got done talking about, right? That it's your intention to raise your hand that causes it to raise, and that's why you're morally responsible for it, right? Or if I slap you, and I meant to do it, right? I'm morally responsible. I was a jerk because I meant to inflict pain on you for no good reason, and there I did it, right? So I've got this mental state, an intention that somehow exists in an immaterial substance, not located anywhere, right? That is somehow then causing my hand to rise. How is that possible? If The mind is an immaterial entity not located anywhere. How would it be possible for my mental states then to affect my physical behavior? Which apparently we all think it does, right? So these are two big puzzles for dualism. Involuntary muscle movement, yeah, we can just put those to the side. What I was saying, I said that a little bit ago. Those are interesting to talk about, but we can just put those to the side because they are not the kinds of things that we think are caused by mental states. Right. Now, of course, it depends on what kind of mental state, right? Involuntary muscle movement. Well, look, yeah, if I accidentally touch fire, there's this interesting thing that happens, right? Earlier, I was just talking about warm water, or maybe you notice it's a little bit too hot and you actually think to yourself, oh, I'm going to take my hands out and adjust it. But if you accidentally touch a hot stove that you didn't know was hot, in fact, scientifically, right, the signal only has to travel to your spine, where the signal is then given to go like that. So it doesn't even affect your mind when you do something like that, right? So yes, those are interesting cases. But what we're mostly interested in the philosophy of mind is the way in which our mental states cause behaviors and the way in which inputs from the environment cause us to have certain mental states. So for all that, we don't really need to talk about involuntary body responses, right? Yeah. Some of them will be relevant, of course, right? So yeah, like this is an involuntary muscle movement. If I touch a hot stove without even realizing, I'll have moved my hand before I even physically feel the pain. That's how it works. But other cases are much more dependent on actually feeling it or actually, thinking about it and acting on a mental state. Yeah. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. You said so I'll take that as it makes sense. So related to these other questions, of course, can the mind exist independently of the brain? Or is the brain what we call a necessary condition for the brain, for the mind? A necessary condition would mean you don't have a mind without a brain. You just simply cannot. There cannot be any mental states without a brain. Right? Is that true? Or can mental states exist apart from a brain? And you might think some things can exist only with a brain, other things can exist without the brain. Right? So as we'll see, someone like Descartes could say that, and more contemporary philosophers who are called panpsychists, people like David Chalmers, believe that consciousness is somehow this primary thing that can exist without a brain, because consciousness exists everywhere, they say. But then, yes, you do need your brain to do math and to do science and to do all this stuff that the brain can do, to do all these cognitive functions that are basically like computer functions, right? All these basically a robot could do all the things that you do. You need a brain for that or a hardware, but consciousness is something quite different, right? So you might say that the level of consciousness that human beings have, that can exist without the brain, perhaps. So I'm saying these all as open questions or different possibilities, right? So it's something to think about, right? Do your mental states have their own independent existence, or are they dependent on the brain? Or to put it more bluntly, is the mind just the brain? Should we just stop talking about a mind? Some people have suggested that mind is just an old holdover from a bygone era, that the mind is just this old word that we had as like I said earlier, a catch-all term for all these processes. But now we know where those processes actually happen. They happen in the brain. Right? So maybe it isn't just that the mind is dependent on the brain, like it's its own thing, but it depends on the brain somehow. Maybe there's no separation at all. Maybe the brain is just all there is. The brain is able to have mental functions, and that's it. Right? That's a possibility as well. And then, yeah, can we give a scientific account of mental processes or mental states? Sometimes I'm going to just not be very specific unless I need to be. right? So I can talk about mental processes and mental states without being all that specific about it or without defining it all that well. Just you can just have in your mind, right? The kind of processes, the kinds of things that we've been talking about. Right? Feeling a pain, having a memory, believing something, desiring something. They're all kind of different concepts, but they're things that we all associate with the mind or mental capacities. At least the way that we're defining mind in a very broad way, right? So, everyday mental processes, can we give a scientific account of those? What about consciousness? As we'll see, consciousness is sort of the last bastion for non-materialism about the mind, for non-physicalism. Consciousness is sort of that final frontier where we're not quite sure yet if we can fit consciousness under the scientific umbrella or not. And that's really where we're at today in the cutting edge of philosophy of mind and psychology, right? Is consciousness to some extent. Is how can we give a scientific account of consciousness? So consciousness specifically, not the mind in general. So like I said earlier, philosophy of mind over time has become more concerned with consciousness than with mind, because it's more and more philosophers are just realizing the science is just too good. It's obvious that many of these mental processes are grounded in the brain, and it's the brain that allows us to do that. And if you damage that part of the brain, you can't do it anymore. Right? So most philosophers of mind are more willing now to say that it's really the brain that's doing all this stuff. But consciousness itself, the ability to be aware, the way that it feels like to be you, to be a human being, to feel the pain that you do, that cannot perhaps be captured by any scientific account, right? So goes that argument, right? So for example, you can describe completely scientifically all the neurons that are involved in me pinching myself, and then the signal gets sent to my brain, what my brain does to it. You can have a completely scientific, physical account of how that works, right? Using the language of science to describe this purely extended world, the spatiotemporal world. And yet you would not have said anything about my feeling of pain, right? This is supposed to be the intuition, right? That somehow there's something different about the subjective feeling of the pain, and then all the physical processes that seem to be involved with that. Yeah, those physical processes maybe are part of it, but they are not the sensation itself, which is subjective in your mind. Only you have access to it. I don't. Yeah. So perhaps consciousness is like that. This ability to have awareness of the world, to have what are called qualia, that there's a certain qualitative aspect to the way that you experience the world. Right? Oh, the smell of coffee. And we talked about this earlier, right? That the world described by physics out there is just a bunch of smell molecules, and we can describe what they look like and what their structure is. But that feeling of coffee, that smell, that sensation of coffee, that's something you sort of need a human consciousness to be there, to have that experience. And without that consciousness, that experience simply would not be there, right? That secondary quality or secondary property, as we've been calling them. So perhaps any scientific account, if it is going to limit itself to that extended world, cannot talk about those conscious states of awareness. That's at least part of the argument. So I'm going to try to make all these different things sound good. Hopefully you've seen this pattern by now. Hopefully no one is going, what's the big picture that I'm supposed to believe? I'm not giving you that, right? I'm giving you different possibilities, different ideas, right? We looked at the history of philosophy, a bunch of philosophers who are agreeing on certain parts but then disagreeing on other parts. And there's no final story that I can tell you, and this is the person that was right about it all, right? All I can do is provide you a history of ideas and a history of people disagreeing about the nature of reality. Then it's up to you, right? So you're not going to get just one view. So I'm going to try to motivate all these different views, these different ways of approaching the concept of, or the topic of philosophy of mind and consciousness. But you're not going to get oh, this is the right way to think about it. I might have some, this is always like this. No professor can truly present anything without any kind of bias at all, right? Even what I'm focusing on, the way I'm setting this all up, this all reflects my personal training and understanding of the material. So there's going to be some extent to which it's not entirely unbiased. But I'm going to try as hard as I can to motivate the different points of view. So, of course, yeah, this leads to a question, as it always does, whenever you do metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is about the nature of reality. We want to know what it's like, right? How do minds work? What are they? That automatically leads to the question of epistemology. How do we do this? How do we proceed? How do we answer these kinds of questions? Is there just some sort of common sense way? Do we just want to basically provide the scaffolding for our folk psychology? Right? Do we just want to sort of start with common sense and try to codify that and formalize that, right? I show you that sketch of folk psychology that we all rely on. Is that just what we do? We just sort of try to make it as explicit as possible, this implicit theory that we're all working on. Is that what we should do? Should we just make that explicit? Just rely on our common sense understanding of one another and about what it takes to be a person with a mind and a consciousness? Or do you take your cues from your religious from your religious system, right? I haven't touched on this time very much, but this whole view that Descartes had of the mind as this immaterial substance, that conforms very well with religious ideas about the soul, right? So if you are a religious believer who is quite committed to the core tenets of their religion, and you think one of the core tenets of your religion is that as long as you have the right kind of relationship with God, then you will go to heaven. Well, you know that it's not your physical body, right? So some part of you must be going on to go to heaven. Which part of you? Well, it's got to be the part of you that's conscious and aware, right? Otherwise, what's the point of going to heaven if you can't enjoy it? There's no difference between that and not going to heaven, right? If your consciousness just ceases to be, is not very helpful or comforting to be told that there's some part of you that goes to heaven. If it's not the part of you that's conscious and aware, right, then it's pointless. So this is the kind of thinking that was influencing Descartes' philosophy of mind, right? The idea that it being if you're a religious person who takes their specific religious text to be foundational, right? So if you're a Christian, not all Christians are like this, of course. There's a wide variety of types of believers, and we'll look at this later on. But there's at least a certain kind of Christian, a certain kind of Muslim who says, I've got my holy book here, I've got my Bible, I've got my Quran, right? This is the foundation. This is my epistemological foundation for all of life. I believe that this is what God wants all of humanity to know, to base everything on, right? The way that Descartes said we must base everything on this firm foundation of the cogito, right? A religious person might say we all need some sort of basis for our epistemology. My religious text provides that basis, and my religious book says that we have these immortal souls. Well, then, that is going to affect your philosophy of mind, isn't it? If that's your background assumption, is that your religious text is correct about the nature of reality, and it says that you will go on to experience happiness in the hereafter. Well, that's going to provide you with your philosophy of mind, right? Because that means that you believe that your consciousness can continue to exist without your brain or your body. And so that's going to give you a particular kind of philosophy of mind if you take that approach. Maybe just by introspection, right? The way that Kant was doing it. Just sort of, and the way that Descartes did it as well, right? Just sort of think about the nature of your mind. And then you can sort of maybe just see what its nature is. Maybe you can just grasp it internally, the way that rationalists think you can grasp things a priori, right? Maybe you can do it that way. Maybe what we need is conceptual analysis. This is what I like. So I think I mentioned before, my training is in analytic philosophy, which has to do a lot with that sort of stuff. Conceptual analysis. How do you actually use words? Right? What do they mean? What are their boundaries? What are their definitions? Things like that. Uh, Certainly, conceptual analysis is very helpful to make certain distinctions. Right. So we saw in Hume, for example, this is an interesting distinction, right? Everyone before Hume would just talk about ideas, ideas as a mental state in this general sense. But Hume, very interestingly, made this very important distinction between an impression and an idea. Right? These are very different kinds of mental states. An impression is this immediate sensory information. That's one kind of mental state. But in a whole different kind of mental states is ideas that I have about those mental states, about those primary mental states that I have. Right? So we have this concept of mental states, but then you might say, well, let's be more specific. And Hume did that, right? So that's a kind of a conceptual analysis. Right? Is how much more refined can we get? Can we make all the proper distinctions? And then we might end up with a different view than we would if we weren't so careful. So analyzing our concepts and being very clear about our language might at least be an important part of this. Science, right? You'd think that we apply science just about everywhere else. Why can't it apply to the mind, right? Well, as we've seen, if you think the mind is this inaccessible, immaterial entity, it's going to be very hard to do any kind of science of the mind. If you can do science of the mind, that seems to imply that the mind is actually something that's physical, that we can actually study with brain science. You see that? So, in many cases, this does depend on what your background assumptions are. Where do you start? Okay, were there any questions? I'm giving you kind of 3 little mini presentations today before we actually zero in on all the specific theories. I'm trying to give you context for everything, basically, right? So we start out with the idea of folk psychology, where I'm just appealing to your intuitive sense that, yeah, you know about mental states because we use those to navigate our social environment, right? How we treat each other, what we say to one another, how we react to one another, how we judge one another's actions in moral terms or in legal terms. These all depend on mental states, or the attribution of what we call mental states. Things like, well, what does that person believe? What does that person think? What is that person feeling? What does that person believe and desire? Right? Okay, and then I move on. Okay, well, we take that as your starting point. Then you can have different ideas about that, right? Different ways of making sense of that primary data. So some general questions you can ask about in philosophy of mind. Okay, now I'm going to do one more. This one, I cannot connect this one to my phone, so it's going to be kind of awkward to go through the slides. You might not understand the relevance of this right away. That's okay. Okay. So it's about 3 right now. I don't think I'll have to stay late today. Okay. Well, good news. As long as I can get this one done, then I'll be happy. Okay. So you understand where we're at, right? We're doing philosophy of mind. And a big question, the way that I'm framing this whole debate about the philosophy of mind is really the sort of scientific physicalist approach that we see in science, right, that we see in psychology, of trying to just tie it to brain structure in some way, or as we'll see in a slightly more nuanced way as well, but grounding it all in just the physical world, or saying that consciousness and the mind has to be some sort of other thing. And maybe there's some sort of intermediary position as well. Okay, that's possible as well. But a lot of this has to do with science and what a science is capable of, okay, in terms of explanation. So for this, I'm going to look at this idea of the great chain of being. I'm going to compare and contrast two different ones, and you should be familiar with both of these already. Oh yeah, wait, I cannot do it like that, so I have to go. Okay, this painting, by the way, is a Beer Stotts painting, in case anybody knows. I just picked it because it shows nature, and we're talking about nature and the nature of reality. Okay. No, nothing very deep about the picture, but this is kind of fun. You're gonna go into the picture. Keep your eye on the picture. Okay, you're gonna go right into it. Whee! Fun, right? Yeah, it's a beautiful painting. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone want to venture a guess what this image is that I'm showing here? Well, this is something that's been dubbed the Great Chain of Being. It's inspired by Plato's metaphysics. So Plato, he was very influential, and later schools of thought arose that really try to take Plato as a kind of foundation and build something akin to something like a religion or a spiritual tradition called Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism made its way into Christianity. Okay, so this right here is a medieval painting or medieval artwork depicting God at the very top. God as the most real being. Remember the form of the good in Plato? Right? These are degrees of reality. Right? So the highest degree is there on the top. And then there's angels and humans, then animals and flora and fauna, and then demons at the bottom, and then pure nothingness at the very bottom. And these are all different degrees of reality. Remember, we saw that in Plato, right? Do you remember this in Plato? We had the divided line. We live in this world down here where things are less real, and the higher up you go, the more real things are. Right? So this picture from Plato made its way into medieval Christianity. So you get this sort of striated cosmology. Right? And here, this is a top-down approach. Right? Here the idea is that there's this intelligent being at the very top who is responsible for somehow creating all this stuff down here. And this is even today, this would be a religious idea, a religious concept. There's a power, there's an intelligence at the very top that is creating all the stuff down here. Right? So that if we see an intelligent being in the world, right, if I see another human being, the assumption is that human being exists with all their complexity and their functionality, whatever cool things we might want to say about the human organism. That's there because there's this God that had a plan, that had an idea for a human being and came up with it and then spoke it into existence or poofed it into existence somehow. Right? A top-down sort of explanation of reality. Right? That's the idea. Here's all these human beings with minds and mental capacities. What explains all that? Well, there's some very intelligent, powerful person, God, that made that happen. Right? A top-down explanation. Right? That's one type of explanation. Another type of explanation, a more scientifically respectable, or at least scientifically familiar picture, is a bottom-up approach. Okay, so I'm going to contrast Plato with Aristotle here. And I'm going to suggest Aristotle is much more in a scientific frame of mind than Plato seems to have been. Do you remember Aristotle's idea about form and matter? Remember this? Here we've got some clay, just a heap of matter. It's not in any particular kind of structure. Right? But we can take that matter and impose some sort of form onto it, right? We can do that. Right? we could impose this form on it, the form of a brick. Yeah, remember this, right? Okay. Just kind of reviewing what Aristotle said. And notice that also we could also take a bunch of bricks that are just lying around in no particular order or shape and impose some sort of form on them, right? So now, even though each individual one is a substance comprised of form and matter, but as a whole, you can take a whole heap of them, and now they are once again a type of matter that we can impose a form on. We can impose a structure and make something like a brick wall. Good so far, right? We remember this. You can do this in all sorts of ways. And of course, you can take those bricks and impose a different form on them and make a fireplace or whatever you want to make with bricks, right? You can do different things. Or you could have taken that clay as the matter and made it into a beautiful sculpture instead. The idea is you can take a bit of matter and do different things to it to get different functionalities out of it. Yeah? Oops. Yeah. So we get this general kind of picture. You can start out with some sort of basic stuff, impose an order on it, and then it has a certain kind of functionality that it did not have before. Notice you can take a lump of clay and throw it at a window. If you're trying to break a window, that's not going to work. You want to impose some sort of form on it where it's a hard brick. Now it can throw windows. Same basic stuff of block of matter, but it's in a different form, and now you can do that, right? Same thing with, you can have a bunch of bricks laying around, but they're not going to give you privacy in your property if they're just laying around like that. But if you stack them up in a certain way, even though it's the same basic physical building blocks, now you have a new functionality. I call this an emergent property. If you've ever heard that phrase, an emergent property, here you see this on display. You can take those bricks and put them as a wall, and it has a certain property now. It can give you privacy and safety. If you put them in a different shape, a fireplace, it'll have a different kind of functionality. There's a different emergent property. I notice the bricks just laying around by themselves don't have that property. But once you have the right kind of function, the right kind of form, they'll have a new property that they didn't have before, even though it's the exact same physical stuff. Are you with me so far? Okay. So now let's get to modern science and our modern understanding of the physical world that surrounds us. So we've talked before about atoms not actually being the bottom layer of reality, right? So there's all sorts of weird stuff that happens when we think about atoms, and there's ways in which scientists really want to do a little bit better than just this chart of all these different kinds of atoms, right? So people are actually working on moving beyond the table of the elements to something a little bit more simple, because we've got all these different, is this really the ground level of reality, all these different atoms? We probably want to think that atoms themselves are able to be what they are because of their internal structure, so that perhaps all atoms have this in common, and so if we want to get deeper, we'll have to study atoms at the subatomic level. Yeah, and people are doing that. But for us, just to keep it simple, let's just stick with atoms, okay? We do know that atoms exist, right? And atoms compose everything around you. I mean, does anyone want to disagree with that? I mean, there are positions in philosophy, anti-realism, that make you be a little bit more careful about the way you say that. But you cannot really deny that this is sort of a part of our scientific understanding of the world. What does EM radiation, how does it apply? Uh-huh. And are you saying that that's not an atomic? Oh, I see. Sure. Okay, yeah. But there's still atoms involved in all that, right? Yeah, it does get a little bit weird. They're kind of their own thing. Sure. Yeah, but what's nice is this won't really be a problem for what I'm setting up here. Yeah, it won't really be a problem because we can fit it into the schema regardless. So it won't be a problem. We can add those as well if you want. But what I want to point out here is that what we get in science is this layered account as well of ever increasing complexity. That increasing complexity is there even if we want to quibble about what's at the bottom rung, at the bottom layer. We do know that there's atoms, right? And we do know that if you combine atoms, what do you get? You can combine different atoms in different combinations, right? If you take two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen, stick them together, you have a water molecule. And that's all there's really to it, right? This is how we understand basic chemistry. Now, again, you might want to say it's not as simple as that. But for the picture that I'm painting here, we can keep it that simple in case Parker has some other interesting thing to say. Maybe you're saying something different, but okay, sure, yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and so this is sort of what we're talking about is you can take the same. Sure, yeah, exactly. So depending on how you combine them, right? So yeah. So you can think about this almost like Legos. Okay, so we saw that set of elements, right? However many there are. You can think, well, we've got a basic Lego kit with different kinds of pieces, but we could put those pieces together in different ways to get different objects. Right? So all the molecules that surround you, that make up everything, they are made out of atoms. There's nothing else going on there. Right? They're simply made of atoms. Now, what can we do with molecules? What? So notice we're going up levels of complexity. We start with simple atoms, but you can combine all those atoms in various ways to make all these different kinds of molecules. And each of those molecules have different properties from one another. And the properties that we talk about at the molecular level are not the properties that we talk about at the atomic level. And yet, there's nothing there but atoms. Okay? I'll repeat that again, but because at each level, we're not actually adding any extra stuff. All we're doing is combining the basic pieces in different ways to get more and more complex structures. And at each level of complexity, we get these emergent phenomena. We get new things that these things can do. And I'll go over those in a second. But first, let me just make the point about increasing complexity. You can take a molecule or a set of molecules, and if they're combined in just the right way, you get a cell, a living cell. Now let's suppose we're talking about a single cell organism. So not even a cell in your body, but just a single cell that can exist on its own. If you zoom in on those, what you will see is a little factory. Okay? It's a little factory. It's a little robot. And it's composed of a bunch of molecules. And those molecules are composed of atoms. We call the cells alive. But notice we have not added any kind of extra ingredient. There's just a bunch of molecules that function the way that molecules function. Just like you could set up a little Roomba, right? A little vacuum cleaner that cleans the floor automatically. It does all this stuff. It sucks in stuff and then it spits out stuff. It needs energy. Cells are like that too. They're just these little automata, these little robots made up of dead molecules. But those dead, I'm saying being colorful, calling them dead. They're neither alive nor dead, right? Molecules, certainly not alive, right? But you combine molecules the right way, then the emergent functionality that happens, we call that life. We have not added life into the equation at all. It is simply life is just what we call the functionality that something like a single cell has. because it can do things like reproduce. It can do things like take in stuff from the environment and then excrete waste. That's what defines life in a biological sense. Yeah, you're with me so far? Okay. I'll go back to all that, to the whole structure, but then you can also take cells, of course, individual cells, and you can combine them in various ways to make organs. Right? Your eyeball, for example, it's just a bunch of cells, right? And those cells are just a bunch of molecules, and those molecules are just a bunch of atoms. Ultimately, your eyeball is just a bunch of atoms. Okay? But of course, it has this very specific structure to it that's very different from the way the atoms are arranged in my coffee cup. Same underlying reality, but because they're structured and organized in a different way, you get a different kind of thing with a different kind of functionality. Just like you can take the same basic, I can give you the same Lego set that I have, and we can build completely different things, right? My thing can go along the floor and like function like a car. Your thing can, I don't know, do something else. So it's the same kind of idea. The same stuff, but different functionalities emerge. And the more complex you get, the more interesting kind of emergent phenomena you get. Okay. Now, of course, organs are kind of weird because organs don't exist all on their own, right? They exist as part of an organism. So really, that's where they shine, right? Once you get to something like, let's talk about human beings, at the very least, the physical parts, right? So bracketing what the mind is, let's not make up our minds about that, right? Let's simply look at the human body. I think it's uncontroversial to say that human bodies are composed of cells. Right? Human bodies are composed of organs, which are composed of cells. And cells are composed of molecules. Molecules are composed of atoms. So your entire body is just a very specific configuration of atoms. Wanting to let that sink in, right? It's a different configuration of atoms as a coffee cup. It's a different configuration of atoms as a dog. But the underlying reality is the same. It's the same basic building blocks, right? That compose me, that compose a dog, that compose a cup of coffee. Same underlying reality, but because of the ways in which complexity can arise by combining those items, combining those things, we get different emergent phenomena depending on how it's done. Right, so then we can look at the whole picture here and look at those emergent phenomena. And notice also that these layers of complexity line up pretty nicely with sciences and how hard or soft they're considered to be. Right? Like physics is the hardest science because it gets right down to that bottom floor of reality, and it tries to simplify everything. Right? So you see how we're getting a bottom-up approach here rather than a top-down approach. You see that? We start with the simple little things down here, and depending on how you combine those, you get different complex phenomena, right? And then we can study those. So physics can study reality at that very basic level of atoms. But then, of course, atoms can combine in various ways to create what we call molecules. Chemistry can study that, right? Molecules can combine in various ways to create all sorts of different things, right? It can create different kinds of rocks, and so geologists might study that, right? But it can also combine to form living cells, and so molecular biologists can study that, right? So your specialty in the sciences, what are you interested in? Well, it's somewhere along this great chain of being, right? You're going to find yourself interested in one of these layers if you're somebody who studies these things. And very often, of course, you'll have to be familiar with some of the other layers. So a chemist might have to be pretty familiar with physics as well to a certain extent. And if you're doing molecular biology, you'll have to know a little bit about chemistry as well. You see that? So it's not necessarily these very thick lines, well-defined lines in between them, but I hope you can see this sort of continuum that exists in reality, and then our specializations and how they study each level at their own level. And it gets more and more difficult the higher you go. So that's why psychology, and then an up a level higher, is sociology, right? I didn't even put that on the map here on my chart. I didn't even do sociology yet, but that's the next level, right? Studying groups of human beings and the interactions that occur within groups. Yeah. So then to look at the emergent phenomena, look at the bottom row. I'm just describing what atoms are like. We're sort of starting here, right? Now, really, what atoms do is also an emergent phenomena of the lower level phenomena, subatomic stuff that's going on that we don't want to talk about. It's too complicated. Let's just start at atoms, right? So combine atoms in various different ways to make molecules, and you will get some cool emergent phenomena, right? So look at where it says emergent phenomena: density, burning, melting, rusting. These things are true of things at the molecular level. That's where the vocabulary applies. And we don't talk about atoms rusting. Of course, the whole process of rusting, it only involves atoms. We don't have to go beyond atoms to get to that, right? You see, so atoms don't rust. Molecules can rust, right? Or collections of molecules. It's an emergent phenomena. We can only talk about it at that level, not at this lower level. And yet, it's nothing but atoms. So you see what I mean by an emergent phenomena then, right? It's a new kind of thing to talk about. Atoms don't burn and melt. But collections of molecules can. Okay? Carrying information like DNA, right? Molecules do that. RNA molecules, DNA molecules, things like that carry information. How amazing is that, right? Atoms by themselves can't carry human genetic information, but atoms combined in the right way, we can talk about carrying genetic information. An emergent phenomena. We do not talk about atoms carrying genetic information. We talk about molecules carrying genetic information. But that does not change the fact that molecules are nothing but atoms. You're starting to see the pattern? We get cool new phenomena at each level of complexity without adding any new ingredients to the mix. So at the cell is where things get very controversial, right? The cell, again, is just a complicated little factory, a little robot made up entirely of molecules. It's just that when you have the right combination of molecules, it has a kind of functionality. It can do things like what we call reproduce and digest, do biosynthesis. And at this level, the phenomena that we call life emerges. Right? We don't have to introduce something into the mix. We don't have to add a new ingredient. All our ingredients are already there. All you need is a bunch of atoms combined in the right way, and then you get life. I think it's easier for people now to accept this because you're aware of molecular biology to some extent. You learned this in school. But it wasn't always obvious. People used to think that life was an extra ingredient that you had to add to dead matter. This is the view known as vitalism. The idea is that there's what they call an élan vital, a life force that's invisible, immaterial. But in order to have any kind of life at all, in order to have a living being, you need this sort of just dead cells, dead atoms, but you need to have some sort of life force injected into it to get life. Nobody thinks that anymore, at least not anybody who has any understanding of science. It's not a controversial position anymore that life is simply an emergent phenomena. right? Everything that you could point to as being life is completely explained in terms of physiology. And physiology is ultimately just a bunch of atoms working together. You know, does everyone see this? This is going to become important that you get it so far as something not that controversial. Right? We simply have more and more emergent phenomena depending on the level of complexity. Right? Cells are much more complex than atoms. They are just atoms combined in various ways, and it's out of those combinations that you get these cool properties, these cool phenomena, like life. Right? I hope that's clear. That in order for something like life to happen as a biological phenomena, all you need is a bunch of molecules that are working together the right way. Yeah? So then you can keep going. Like I said, organs, there are still going to be emergent phenomena, but really that makes the most sense in the context of an actual human organism. So I'm just going to skip up to the very top. Okay? So now we have, at the very least, human bodies that are composed of organs, and organs are composed of cells. Cells are composed of molecules. Molecules are composed of atoms. So there, your human body and all its functionalities, the way that it's shaped and everything, has to do with what kind of atomic arrangement you have, right? Your atomic arrangement is slightly different from mine, but there's going to be enough things in common that we call both of them human bodies. So then the question is, what emergent phenomena happen at that level? What emergent phenomena happen at this very high level of complexity? And I think this is really the sticking point. This is really what the debate comes down to. The scientifically minded philosopher of mind is going to say, however we characterize the mind and consciousness, it is simply another one of these emergent phenomena. We might disagree about how we state the relationship between the mind or consciousness and the body. We might disagree about all sorts of stuff, but the scientifically minded philosopher of mind is going to say, yes, the mind, human consciousness, it's just like life. There's no extra ingredient needed. Consciousness, mental states, these are simply what emerge when you have a sufficiently complex organism with a complex brain like we do. Right? On this view, consciousness, mental processes and states are simply something that human brains can do by virtue of their complexity. Right? And so to that view, there's no point saying, well, you can't just be atoms because atoms don't think. Yeah, well, atoms aren't alive either. But if you put enough atoms together in the right kind of combination, then you get life. Right? Let me say that again, right? Sometimes it's an objection to say that consciousness and the mind could be purely physical in that way by saying, yeah, but you're made of all of atoms and atoms are not conscious, so therefore you can't be conscious. Well, it just does not follow, right? In the same way that individual atoms or molecules are not alive, yet when you put molecules together in the right way and the right kind of functionality arises, we call that life. Even though atoms are not alive. In the same way, the scientifically minded philosopher of mind will say, consciousness, the mind, it's the same sort of thing. It's wonderful and amazing and confusing sometimes, but there's no reason to think that this cannot fit into our overall picture of reality. Because look at what a consistent picture we get from the sciences. All these different fields working together, each of them recognizing the reality of these lower levels, each of them working together, right? Looking at the whole entire world, right? What does this not encompass, right? We talk about all sorts of phenomena in the world in these terms. Why not the mind? Why not consciousness? Why shouldn't that just fit into all the other stuff that we're doing? Right? So that's one way, one sort of an inclination, perhaps, right? That you're inclined to go this way. So you might find yourself kind of in agreement with that. Or, based on your prior assumptions, you might think, no, that's not the case. Consciousness, or the mind in general, perhaps, it does not fit into this picture the way these other things do. Right? So this is a lot what the debate is about. Is the mind explicable in terms of this picture? Or is there something about the mind that simply does not allow for us to fit it into this picture in this way? Yeah? Or we might have to rearrange things altogether. Right? Notice for Descartes, his answer is going to be simple. No, the mind is not an emergent phenomena. Right? It's its own thing. We cannot explain it in terms of brain complexity or molecular complexity. It's its own thing with its own explanation. Or you're one of these panpsychists who, the best I can understand them, is they think that consciousness itself is at the very bottom. Right? That it's a basic constituent of reality, just like the atom is, and it's not reducible to something else. You might take that approach as well. But notice that it's not a top-down explanation, it's a bottom-up explanation, and it's one that conforms very nicely, right, goes along very nicely with evolution, of course, right, because evolution shows that over time you can get increasing complexity. You might not be able to start with a human being just poof out of nowhere, but all you need is adding little bits of complexity over time, and then you can come up with something like a human organism who's able to feel consciousness and have a mind and all that stuff. Right? This is what evolution tells us. And it's a bottom-up approach. You start with very basic ingredients, some basic ground floor level of reality that can then, over time, just by following the laws of physics, right, all those atoms are behaving the way atoms ought to, but because of their properties, they are able to combine into molecules, and all the molecules are just doing what they're supposed to, mindlessly, right? But those molecules combine, and over time you get more and more complex life forms, and over time these sorts of phenomena arise. The more complex the organism becomes, the more capabilities it has. Right? So it's a bottom-up explanation of human consciousness, whereas the top to bottom is, well, God already with a mind and consciousness somehow, right, creates it, means to make a human being with a mind, and there's some sort of intention to it beforehand, whereas the bottom-up approach is not. The bottom-up approach is this evolutionary kind of approach where nature is a blind watchmaker, right? It's the analogy that Richard Dawkins gave. Nature is not intending for anything to happen. Nature just has a certain set of laws with it that might just be a brute fact. Given those laws and given enough time, you can get emergent phenomena. It's just what we notice. And human consciousness is just part of that picture. Right? Very different from the top-down approach, which says, no, there's a being that made it and intended it to happen. Right? Which, of course, there are things to be said for that view, because consciousness and the mind, it's sometimes difficult to fit it within the scientific paradigm. Of course, there's problems with it as well, because you haven't really explained what makes it possible for God to have consciousness or a mind. Right? How did that happen? Why does God just have a mind? Right? That question would not have been answered either. But at least it does go some way to answering the question, where does consciousness come from? Easy. God made it. It's an immaterial thing. It's your soul. Right? So two basic kinds of approaches, but also approaches in between, and as we'll see, what are called the physicalists, right? The scientifically minded philosopher of mind. We can call them physicalists because, they think ultimately you don't have to go beyond the physical world of atoms to explain consciousness. Right? There will be the physicalists, and then there will be the dualists, but then there will also be kind of weird cases, and there will be different kinds of physicalists, right? Once you say, well, there isn't something beyond the physical to explain consciousness or the mind, there's still different ways that you can do that, right? And so we'll look at least 3 different ways that you can do that. Okay, so that was it. I promised I wouldn't go. Well, I didn't promise. I suggested that maybe I wouldn't be late. I'm a little bit late, but we can stop here. Okay, so hopefully that set the context for what we're going to look at, and hopefully this gets you thinking about what your position is. Right? You know, does it fit into the scientific picture, or maybe you have some other alternative that I hadn't even mentioned? You know, maybe some sort of in between picture. Who knows? Right? Um, you could also be, for example, a theist, a person who believes in God, who thinks that God sort of set up the world, that evolution is true, that it all happened like that, but God set up the initial conditions, right? That's a sort of a compromised position, you know. There's that possibility as well. Okay, any questions or comments or clarification? Good. Plenty of food for thought, right? Plenty of things to think about. And hopefully, if you're very comfortable with your own position, right, whatever it may be, then your exercise will be to really understand where the other person's coming from. Why don't they agree with your point of view? Right? Try to dig into that a little bit, either just by thinking about it or by reading up on it. I gave you some readings and videos to watch. So all this stuff should stimulate some thought on your part. But hopefully you'll think about it. I mean, hey, this is what you are, right? A human being. This is what defines you to some extent, is your consciousness, your awareness, your mind, your ability to think about yourself and your place in the world. You know, all this, right? This is the kind of thing that made Socrates say the unexamined life is not worth living, right? What are you even doing as a human being if you don't pause to reflect on your own condition for a second? What sort of being are you, right? What are you? Yeah. So that's what this question is about. So you don't have to just think of it as this abstract philosophy of mind. It's just, what are you? What kind of being are you? Right? What is to you? Right? Okay, I should just stop talking so that you know you can leave. But I'll hang out for a sec. Yep, later everyone. Bye. Have a good weekend. And yeah, let this keep you up at night.
Wait, just chapter 10 then?
Off top of my
Well, it reads, right?
Whatever's in the. I don't have my book right here, so I can't double check.
It's,
If that's what
yeah,
it
looks
says,
like it.
let me double check here.
Yeah, well, they're all, I think everyone's gone anyway. That doesn't really matter.
I hope that one actually matches up, though. Let's see.
I was just there. Free will is, I think free will is,
Yeah,
you
chapter
haven't
10, that might
said.
be wrong. I got to look because I think everything got a little mixed up. So actually, thank you for
10 is,
pointing that out.
10 is how you, is how
Maybe.
is your mind related, how is your mind related to your body is 10.
Oh, that is 10.
And,
Okay.
yeah, and then 9 is free will.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So yeah, you should be on 10.
Right, but I don't think you had us read 9. You never had us.
I had you read 9 already?
No, you stopped at 6. Our last reading was 6.
Yeah, we're sort of skipping around a bunch.
Yeah, okay. No worries.
Yeah, okay. I should have had a reading for week 7. Anyway, week 8, this makes sense. Yeah, the philosophy of mind, read chapter 10. So yeah, we skip from 6 to 10. And when we go to free will, we'll go back to 9.
Okay, cool. That one guy who does the quick videos about philosophy.
Yeah, Crash.
Yeah, he keeps showing up on my Twitter feed. Like he's all over the place.
Really?
TikTok and yeah, Hank Green, I guess is his name.
Yeah, Hank Green. That's right. Well, it's really funny.
Yeah,
philosophy is enjoying a kind of a renaissance in the public. You know, when I studied philosophy, it's always very esoteric and nobody knows about it. These days, everyone's very interested in philosophy. I think mostly because you can go on the internet and get some pretty decent, quick introductions that really just. I think it's really great. I think it's amazing that just so many people on their own who don't even go to school are starting to learn all sorts of stuff about philosophy because of resources like that that make it kind of fun, but they are informative and good. Yeah, I think it's great.
Well, I think it's a bad rap in a lot of ways too, just because people question what you can do with it. I think
Yeah.
you know, but
Yeah, for sure.
then again, like I'm thinking about going to law school, and like they recommend, they philosophy is one of like the best, I guess, that economics are like great things to go into law, those two subjects, which you wouldn't think either of them would actually be, but they
Right.
evidently prepare you, phenomenally better than most things,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so those kind of jobs, the employers there know that people who study philosophy are likely to be able to think about things analytically, to be able to stand back and look at the big picture, to be able to be careful in the way they come up with conclusions. All these sorts of things that that are philosophical virtues. These are very helpful in many workplace environments, for sure. So it has that kind of practicality, for sure. Yeah. Of course, there are all sorts of things that philosophers talk about that nobody cares about, and that it's hard to see how it has any relevance. That also does happen, but yeah, it's not a good idea to dismiss the whole field just on the basis of that. Yeah.
Well, I don't think Hank Green is actually a philosopher. Like, I
No,
don't think he
that's
even went
right.
to school for philosophy. I think he's a biologist or something, from what I
Yeah, I
remember
don't
reading
even
about
know
him.
his background. His brother, I think it's his brother. He looks just like him. Does Crash Course History.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think that's.
they,
I think probably they have a team of writers because he's
well, for
explaining
sure.
some pretty basic stuff. So they probably have writers or something like that, and he's able to present it in a entertaining format. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the company is worth like $20 million, so he's doing something right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
All
pretty
right,
cool.
man. How's everything else with you?
All right. You too. Bye.